Yeah, thank you. There we go.
Do we know we're good?
I think so. The blue scared me a little bit, but now I think we're back on.
Okay. If I could have your attention. On 25 October 2024, President Joe Biden formally apologized to Native Americans for what he described as, quote, one of the most horrific chapters in American history, end quote. Government-funded boarding schools that over a 150-year period abused Indigenous children and forced them to assimilate. The extent of that federal program's damage had been revealed in detail 2 years earlier with the publication of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report, an investigation initiated in 2021 by Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, herself a Native American. Among the tasks of the initiative was to identify the locations of marked and unmarked burial sites of the remains of Indigenous children located at or near school facilities. It was a long overdue investigation and an even longer overdue formal apology. After all, our tariff-plagued neighbor to the north, Canada, had offered its apology to its First Nations people 17 years earlier. This task of identifying unmarked burial sites in Canada continues to this day, and one of the investigators from 2022 to 2023 was our speaker for this morning, Trenton Voth. Trent earned his baccalaureate degree in history, biblical studies, and philosophy at Tabor College in 2007, a Master of Arts in Biblical Studies from Fresno Pacific University Biblical Seminary in 2012, and his PhD in Bible Studies, New Testament, from Emmanuel College, University of Toronto in 2022. Along the way, he served as transitional pastor at Toronto United Mennonite Church. And relevant to his topic for this morning, he served as an archival assistant for the Anglican Church of Canada Archives. He currently serves as assistant professor of Bible and Religion at Bethel College, and my sources on the ground on campus, of which I have many, assure me that he is a fantastic professor. So please help me welcome Trent Voth as he presents The Long Road to Toyaktuk. It's as good as I can do.
That's good.
And there are lots of seats up here. Trent.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you for having me. I've had the privilege of coming to BCMC a couple of times, and you're having an influence on me. I don't normally wear a tie, so you're definitely rubbing off on me. This is a little bit different than the sermons that I've been able to give, where I've been able to pull back the curtain on at least how I read the Bible and how that might impact our religious communities. As Dale pointed out, I had the privilege for about a year to work with the Anglican Church of Canada General Synod in Toronto and the Canadian government as an archival researcher. And part of this presentation, The Long Road to Tuktoyaktuk, is a reflection on some of that research. Just to let everybody in the room know, this is going to engage with some very painful topics. The disappearance and abuse of children, death and graves, injustice and racism and genocide. So if at some point it would be helpful for you for your mental health to take a break or step out of the room, I really will not be offended by that. So please do what you need to take care of yourself. The Indigenous Residential School Program, or the initiative that the Canadian government participated in from 1865 until 1991, and then has been doing a Truth and Reconciliation process since then, stretches back even before Canada was a nation. The earliest evidence that we have of Indigenous residential schools stretches back at least to 1827 in Winnipeg, St. John's. The residential school system, if you're not familiar with it, is a compulsory boarding school system in which Indigenous students or Indigenous children were taken from their tribal lands or their families and brought to a centralized location, sometimes hundreds of miles or hundreds of kilometers away from where their family were. The purpose of the residential school system is multifaceted and complex. Of course, some of it is meant to educate, and that's how it was pitched by the Canadian government to Indigenous communities, that as a society, we all want to be sharing in the same educational process, and because we can't fund schools in every community, we're going to ship your kids to this central location. But of course, an underlying part of the program was to assimilate students into a shared cultural identity that was presented to be Canadian. Of course, this means removing or suppressing the cultural identities that students brought to those schools. And the Canadian government partnered with religious institutions as a way of delivering these education assimilation programs. So this is the headquarters of the Anglican Church in Toronto, St. Paul's Cathedral. My office was actually back behind in this apartment building. The Anglican Synod owns the building and operates its national organization through the first 3 floors. So the archives are back on the 3rd floor of this apartment building back behind here. The project that I worked on focused on Indigenous residential schools that were first run by the Church of England when Canada was a colony of England from 1820 till 1865. The Church of England continued to run the residential schools until a handover took place in 1920. So the Anglican Church of Canada controlled the schools from about 1920 to 1991, and before that it was the Church of England. But the archival documents are located in Toronto. Over the course of those 2 centuries, the Anglicans operated somewhere around 37 residential schools. We don't know the number precisely, partially because before about 1880 or 1890, the records start to get pretty confusing. For one thing, there were a handful of schools that had the same name that were located in different communities. The schools tended to be named after Christian heroes of the faith, St. John, St. Peter's. So you would have a St. Peter's in one community and a St. Peter's in another. But what tended to happen, not a single school run by the Anglicans failed to burn down at some point. There was a fire at every single school. And when a school burned down, sometimes they moved the school to a different community but kept the name. Sometimes they moved to a community and changed the name. So the records aren't completely clear how many residential schools the Anglican Church operated, but there were at least 37. These are the relative locations of those schools. The circles represent the general locations. Most of them are, of course, in Western Canada. There is one located quite close to Toronto, but shockingly, you've got some far, far up in the north above the Arctic Circle. We'll get into some of the stories of those schools a little bit. The way the system operated, or how it started, the British Empire spread out throughout the world in that age of discovery, and as it came across different resources, different communities, it realized that there was opportunity for economic expansion. In Canada, the institution that was the spearhead of that economic expansion was the Hudson's Bay Company. So perhaps you've heard of Hudson's Bay. This is the company it's named after, very similar to other trading companies like the Dutch East India Company. The Hudson's Bay Company would set up trading posts in different locations, maybe in an indigenous community where they could trade for beaver skins, or later on when mineral mining became an important facet of the Canadian economy, then Hudson's Bay might participate in something like that. And wherever you have a trading post, you have a fort, a military outpost that's equipped with British imperial soldiers to protect the economic interests. And wherever you have soldiers and tradesmen, you get a priest or a pastor that originally starts off ministering to the military fort personnel, and maybe if the officers have their families with them, or the trading personnel at the Hudson's Bay Trading Post. But little by little, the Church of England or the Anglican Church also realizes there's an opportunity to also do some evangelism work with the indigenous communities nearby. So it starts off where Anglican priest or missionary will send out some feelers into indigenous communities. Do your kids want to come participate in our worship services or be a part of the school that we've started for the children of the officers at the fort? So the original schools begin as a little bit more of a collaboration or an outreach program to indigenous communities. Then, when Canada starts to realize that it doesn't have enough resourcing in these communities to start independent schools, it's just easier to integrate religious schools into the education system. So many of these schools start off in that kind of triumvirate relationship between military empire, economic forces like Hudson's Bay Company, and then the church. You can see that relationship play out in a specific community. This town is called Moose Factory, Ontario. And you can get a sense of what the Hudson Bay Company was producing at Moose Factory. Okay? This is the former location of the Hudson's Bay Fort. It's now a historic site. Some buildings from the trading post are still there. This is the location of the Anglican Church that was in Moose Factory, Ontario. And then this was the residential school. It still operates as a school today. It's just a day school, typical to the schools we have here in Kansas, where students come from about 9 a.m. until 4 p.m. and then go back to their homes. But geographically, you can see how these three institutions all grew up around each other. Moose Factory happens to be one of the schools that operated fairly early. It started in 1855 and closed down in 1969. Of course, much more recently, the aspect of Canadian history that we're talking about has gained more attention. Back in around 2018, there were unmarked graves discovered at a school in Kamloops, British Columbia, that made the news, at least in Canada and maybe around here. What we're discovering is that there are more unmarked graves at these schools than even people thought there would be. There was always some rumors or expectations that there would be some unmarked graves, but throughout the archival research, we're discovering more. The reality is, I believe at this point, around 2,250 graves have been identified on residential school properties in Canada. I suspect that number will grow significantly. there were processes in place to do searches for graves when the pandemic hit, and they all got delayed. The Anglican Church of Canada had originally planned to pace them out in such a way that you would hear about one school a year. The pandemic has now delayed that process, and we're probably on the cusp of getting a report that will result in a lot more graves being announced all in one chunk. The exact figure will probably never be known, but this is the project I worked on as a researcher. This is what the archives at the Anglican Church of Canada look like. This was my supervisor, Laurel. She's wonderful. The archives, if you've ever been in some archives, are just rows upon rows of these shelves. On each of the shelves are just hundreds and hundreds of boxes. Inside the boxes are hundreds and hundreds of documents. These shelves actually look sparse because we had a flood, and we had to move all of the archival material elsewhere, but this was the only picture I had to work with. What we're doing is going through each of these boxes, which contain letters and budgets and church registries especially, anything that could ever be collected, sermon notes and reports, and in some of the boxes, funeral and burial information. Part of what we were participating in building is this National Center for Truth and Reconciliation website. So if you go to Google and type that in, click on this link, it will take you to this page. And we were working specifically on this memorial portion up at the top, which brings up a list of provinces that you could click on. If you clicked on the northern provinces, you might come across a school like Stringer Hall, an Anglican residential school or residential hostel in Inuvik, Northwest Territories, and gives a little bit of a description, and then down below, we have a list of students that we know died while at the school. And we were compiling or going through the research to identify who these students were, and specifically where they might be buried, where their remains would be. There's a lot that I can't divulge to you because of NDA that I signed at the beginning, but I can tell you that I didn't do the research for any of these students. So I didn't identify any of these. Here's how we did it. In those boxes, on those shelves, in that archive, are burial registries. Perhaps BCMC has something similar, that you just keep a record of the funerals that you hold here, the burials that might take place in a graveyard that gets utilized by BCMC. The Anglicans and the British Empire, for whatever you think about them, they keep really good records most of the time. As a result, this is a segment of a burial registry dating from about 1894 through 1902. This is listing various people that died at this particular Anglican, connected to this particular Anglican church. And we would go through looking for individuals who might be students at the residential school that was nearby. Now, you can see I've cut off the names for privacy's sake, but we're looking for people that are aged between around 4 and 18. If you look closely, that would be these individuals. Okay? So here you have an 11-year-old Indian lad, died of dysentery August 13th, 1894, and the minister who conducted the funeral was Thomas J. Marsh. Here's a 5-year-old Indian boy, died of dysentery in 1894, September 1894. 13-year-old female, Indian female, 16-year-old Indian lad, 11-year-old schoolgirl, so we're very confident that that was a student at the residential school. 8-year-old Indian girl, 13-year-old. So then we try to figure out who these individuals are, and where their remains were buried. This particular burial registry comes from St. Peter's Anglican Church in Hay River, Northwest Territories. This school operated from 1895 to 1937. This is the former location of the school. The school burned down, so it's not there anymore. And I don't know off the top of my head where it was originally located, but this is the church where Thomas J. Marsh was ministering. When we're looking at satellite imagery, we're looking for signs of graves. Sometimes they're very easy to see, like there's a marked cemetery that we can identify. And when I did this presentation in Bethel's Convocation, I had students tell me where they thought the graveyard was, and I want to see if you can do it too. So here's a little grid. Can you identify the graveyard in this photo? Just anybody shout it out, the letter and the number. D2, that's exactly right. D2, that's where the graveyard is. When you're looking for graveyards in satellite imagery, if you can identify mounds that are parallel and spaced out and about the size that a grave would be, that's a really good giveaway. Right angles are a pretty good giveaway. What about in this one? D4. Yeah, that's right. This is the graveyard. It's a little bit harder to see. This is further north, way up near the Arctic Circle, where burials are harder to get through the permafrost. So it's a little bit tougher to see grave mounds. All right. Here's the church. Here's our grid. Don't get confused by this. This is a garden. This one's a little bit harder to see. When you're looking for graveyards in forests, you might look for right angles, or you might look for a patch where there are newer, younger trees than older, greener, or darker, greener trees. It's very hard to see, but the graveyard is up here. Okay? For the students that we identified in that particular burial registry that Thomas J. Marsh kept, all of them are buried in that graveyard. So we don't expect there to be unmarked graves at St. Peter's Indian Residential School in Hay River, because we have a higher level of confidence that we have identified the victims that were at the school and where they're buried. We also run into situations where we can identify victims, but we can't identify where they're buried, and that's when you start to think there might be unmarked graves somewhere. Another really fascinating dynamic in the Canadian Indigenous residential school system, and maybe it plays out in the United States, I don't know. There was competition between Protestant denominations running residential schools and Catholic residential schools, to the degree that Hay River, a small indigenous community, had two residential schools. There was the Anglican side of the reservation, and there was the Catholic side of the reservation. So there's a Catholic residential school that also burned down, and a Catholic cemetery for the victims of the Catholic school. So it adds this completely wonky dynamic when you're looking for victims, simply because you're navigating denominational complexities. There are letters in those archival documents of Anglican bishops and Anglican priests talking about, we can't shut down our residential school. If we do, our neighbors in Rome will get the community. So there are residential schools that stayed open long, long past the point of being viable or helpful for the community in any way, simply as a way of competing. And that would be on all sides of the topic. There'd be Catholic schools that stayed open because they didn't want to hand over the town to the Anglicans. If I didn't mention it, the Anglican Church of Canada and the Catholic Church of Canada by far operated the most residential schools, although the Mennonite Church in Canada is affiliated with at least 3 that we know of, mostly in Western Ontario. As of 2023, teams like the one I was on helped identify around 2,205 residential school graves, but they're not always where you would expect them to be, and that's part of the struggle. This is a community, let me make sure I get the name right, Fort Simpson, Northwest Territories, and this is the former residential school Bumpus Hall. It was an Anglican residential school, and you can see there's a graveyard in this photo as well. It's up here. That is the Fort Simpson Municipal Graveyard. There are also graves here in this little patch of ground. There's a Catholic graveyard and an Anglican graveyard there. So very nearby the school. The surprising thing is, when there was a search for graves at this location, they found them here. So again, the Fort Simpson graveyard, an Anglican seminary, a Sacred Heart Roman Catholic seminary. Here's the Anglican church in Bumpus Hall, and unmarked graves were found in this location. Now, some would propose that there was nefarious activity going on here, because why would you bury children in such a weird place? They must have been trying to hide something. I don't think that's the case. This is a really obvious place for a grave to be. Like, people would have known that there was a grave dug there. There's some reason why people in the town buried some students in that location, and that reason has been lost to us. But it wasn't trying to hide them. They would have known it. There are other stories from other residential schools where there was very clearly an intent to hide the graves. But I don't think that's what's going on here. But it does bring up a point. Oh, I should also mention, the fence wasn't there. That fence was added after the graves were discovered to kind of mark out a sacred space. So it was just a sports field or a playing field. And we get stories from victims of the residential school system anecdotal stories that would say something like, yeah, when I was at the school, we were always told, don't go play over in that part of the garden, or don't go into that corner of the property. And we always thought that that part was haunted. Those kinds of stories originate from somewhere earlier where perhaps a burial took place, and then over the years, it just became an urban legend at the school. So when we hear stories like that, that's where we go look first. Back to this Moose Factory, Ontario, and why finding unmarked graves is such a difficult task. So again, here's where the school was. There's a document in the archives that reads like this. There are 3 graveyards present at Moose. This document comes from an Anglican priest detailing where people were buried. It's written in about 1930. There are 3 graveyards present at Moose. The present burial ground around the church. So if we were looking for students, we might check that graveyard around the church. There's also a fort graveyard where the bishop and some archdeacons are buried. And then there's an old Indian graveyard. The location of this is between the present mission and the church. Its location is almost unknown except by old-timers. There are graves in this neighborhood. We don't know where they are. Now, you could imagine, do you think the owners of these homes would be quite enthusiastic about letting a search team come through? What if they find a grave? If they find a grave, what's my responsibility as the homeowner? Do I need to put a fence around it and make the ground sacred? Do I just ignore it? Does my home value go up or down? There's quite a bit of resistance when we discover that there are probably graves where private property is held. This isn't a completely foreign kind of idea. Here in Newton, there's a graveyard located just a little bit away from Shalom Mennonite Church and Slate Creek Elementary. As soon as the Newton city was platted and the railroad tracks were laid in 1861, Newton was bustling with activity, and the city created a cemetery just on the other side of the creek. Boot Hill Cemetery in 1871. It's located at 809 East 1st Street in Newton. Now, some of you probably have heard about it or know about it. But again, this is a cemetery that just kind of gets forgotten or lost to time. So sometimes when we think there might be unmarked graves, it's not because there was nefarious activity or some villain twisting their mustache trying to hide kids' remains. The cemetery just got lost. That happens especially in the northern latitudes where permafrost and freezes cover up grave markers. I mean, if you make a grave marker out of wood and you get a really heavy snow for a few years, it just gets wiped away. So not everything is villainous intent. As Dale pointed out, in October of 2024, President Biden apologized for the U.S. government's role in running more than 523 Native American boarding schools. According to an NPR article by Gabriel Pietrozia, calling it a blot on American history, President Biden formally apologized in Arizona for the federal government's role in running boarding schools, where thousands of Native American children were abused, neglected, and eradicated of their tribal identities. The United States, from what we can gather, ran 523 schools. Canada ran somewhere around 127. So when the United States chooses to start investigating its school grounds, you will hear of unmarked graves. It will be a factor, just like it's a factor in Canada. The Canadian government is a little bit ahead on that road. The closest residential school to us, if you haven't heard the story, this is North Newton, Bethel campus. There was a residential school run by Mennonites in Halstead, just about 8 miles away. The Crable family operated Crabletown near Halstead, and it's an area of more research. It's a project that I'm eager to take on at my time at Bethel. A lot of people have already done very rich research in this area, but I imagine we will encounter similar kinds of resistance as we walk further down our own history in residential schools, as we try to figure out what kinds of legacy we have connection to at Crabletown and Halstead. Now, I don't think I've encountered any records stating that students died at Crabletown, but there would be stories that we still need to grapple with as a community. I want to tell one final story before opening it up for some questions, to kind of give you an impression of what a tragedy at one of these residential schools unfolded like. If you remember, here's the graveyard. This is Inuvik, a big city in Northwest Territories in Canada, and Stringer Hall was the residential school run by the Anglicans in Inuvik. It's way up here in the far, far north. This is one of the personal stories I'm permitted to tell because it's made its way into Canadian news and kind of been spread around. It's the story of three boys, Bernard Anderson, Jack Elinick, and Dennis Dick. Bernard was 11, Jack was 11, and Dennis was 13. It's June 26, 1972, because if you're going to school above the Arctic Circle, you don't go to school from October to May, or August to May, you go to school from April to October. So it's June, it's the middle of the school year. 1972. One day, Bernard, Jack, and Dennis snuck away from the school, and they're trying to decide what to do. Their hometown of Tuktoyaktuk is 90 miles, or 130 kilometers to the north. It's on the Arctic Ocean. The road to Tuktoyaktuk ends in Inuvik. There is no road to Tuktoyaktuk. If you want to walk there, you walk through the wilderness. So, here's Inuvik, 90 miles away on the Arctic Ocean is Tuktoyaktuk. It's June and warm-ish. It's light, 24 hours a day. And 11 to 13-year-olds think you can walk 90 miles in a couple of days. So they head off walking, and they get to the end of the road in Inuvik. But there are power lines. Inuvik is where the power plant is for Tuktoyaktuk. So the power lines stretch all the way. So the boys decide to follow the power lines. In the first few days, they walked along the power lines, eating wild berries and drinking from melt pools. After a few days, the weather turned, and it got cold and rainy, and they came to a swollen creek and couldn't cross it. And then Jack got sick, and he was crying all the time. When Jack couldn't continue walking, Bernard decided to stay with him while Dennis, the 13-year-old, went on to Tuktoyaktuk to find help because they thought they were close. A storm overtook Bernard and Jack, and they huddled in a bush to ride it out. And the next morning, Jack couldn't get up. Bernard made sure he was as comfortable as possible and memorized some landmarks so he could find Jack again. And then he also went off towards Tuktoyaktuk, again, because they thought they were close. A helicopter spotted Bernard 2 weeks later, 8 miles from Tuktoyaktuk. They found Jack's body later the next day, right where Bernard had told them to look. Still, 52 years later, we have never been able to find Dennis. That's why on the memorial page for Dennis and Jack, we approximate their date of death. So why'd they do it? Why try to walk to Tuktoyaktuk? Bernard says they were scared of the punishment for sneaking out, but I've seen behind the scenes. I suspect they were scared of something they just took for granted as a matter of fact in the residential school system. They knew the schools weren't safe places where danger and abuse and death and disease were far more familiar than we'd ever imagine today. These three boys, 11, and 13, were the pallbearers for this boy who died just a month earlier. Robert had gone out one day canoeing in this pond, and the canoe had tipped over and he had drowned, and Jack, Dennis, and Bernard were his close friends and carried him to this graveyard. I think that's why they ran away. They were running for safety. They were fearful for their lives. And 2 of them died. You can multiply their stories by the thousands and spread it across generations and continents. And while Canada and the United States are very slowly inching towards reconciliation, it is still a long, long road to Tuktoyaktuk. But I do think we're building it, even if slowly. So, thank you for the opportunity to present this. It's very meaningful and purposeful for me. It's a part of my journey that was very hard, but I feel allows me to tell stories that I was not previously aware of, and I think are important. So thank you for the opportunity. If you have questions, I would love to respond to some if you feel comfortable sharing them.
Fritz, can I have the mic? Yes. If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring the mic.
I don't have a question. I just have a comment. I worked with Lena, who comes out of Oklahoma, out of the Koinonia Indian Church there. They are working with MCC to identify graves in Halstead. And we have there were a couple of them that we are pretty sure are there. And there's going to be a MCC kind of gathering to talk about this more. I don't know all the details, but in spring here in Newton, so people should go to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I should point something out. MCC is how I got the job. The Anglican Church was looking for an archival assistant. The Indigenous woman in charge of it was from Winnipeg. And when I applied, all of my CV says Mennonite on it. And she said, I know the Mennonites. I know they work for justice. We'll hire Trent. It had nothing to do with my education or my preparedness. It was because our community has made some inroads in Indigenous justice and people know about it. So that's how it happened.
Would you reflect on I've heard that the purpose of the Indian schools was to prepare the Native Americans to become farmers with their own farmland, and that this was a totally unrealistic expectation, because none of them actually became independent farmers. But that was the goal of the Halstead School for the Native Americans who were there. It is a completely unrealized objective.
Yes. There's an irony in expecting people to be farmers and taking their land. There were some residential schools in Canada. I can't speak to the U.S. schools, and I feel like that's an area of research that I need to pursue. But in Canada, there were some schools that were set up as what we would maybe term vocational calling or vocational training institutions, some of which tried to instill some farming practices. But yes, it's very difficult to do generational abuse to a society and then expect them to be able to operate your societal systems.
Trent, I noticed one of the boys was Dennis Dick. Was he West Prussian or Moluchna Mennonite?
Oh, neither, but it raises a very important point that also makes it difficult to identify students. And it'll be really shocking to you, I think. Some schools would change students' names when they arrive. They have an indigenous name, and when they show up, they get an Anglicanized name or an English name. So you would have Johns and Peters and Simons, and if a student were to die, then the next male that arrives at the school would get that name. Ooh. So we have, and this is especially before like 1880, but going back in those records, you have John Lightfoot, and there are 5 of them, and because he's from the Lightfoot tribe, it just makes it impossible to identify who these kids are. So yeah, that's a component of it. Yeah, thanks, Dale.
Other question, here we go.
Steve and I worked in Canada, in Manitoba, from 66 to 69. We heard nothing about these schools. And, you know, it was right there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that the people in our community, we had a public school.
Yeah.
So the kids were not taken away. They only left when they were to high school because the high school was a long ways away from home. But the little kids got to live at home.
Yeah. I grew up in Hallstead. I never knew. I know the property that Crable is on, and never would have thought. Yeah.
I could develop all kinds of hypotheses about one of the footnotes you have there. So how wide were all of these schools burned? Was it to hide something? Was it they all had the same bad wood burner? What?
Yeah.
That seems to be more than a coincidence.
It is. Yeah. I want to tell you one more story. When Canada was being colonized, an Anishinaabe chief, Shingwak, had a vision. This would be around 1801, 1802. Chief Shingwak had a vision that settler children and indigenous children would all come together, learning one another's cultures and values, helping one another to live in this land together. So he built a school for all the children in his area to gather together to shape the future. On the second day of operation, the school burned down. That is how you protest. There were individuals in Canada who saw Shingwak's vision and didn't want it, so they burned the school down. It was arson. And every Anglican school in Canada burned down because of arson. If you're a 10-year-old boy, that's how you protest. You make sure your friends are out, and then you light it up. Every single one burned. Yeah.
Did they ever try to get some of these deceased children back to their families? Or are they all buried in these graveyards?
Yeah. Because it's such a long period in history, there are different approaches throughout the different eras. So early on, when transportation was much harder, so 1820 to about 1880, there was very little effort put into transporting remains. And few families requested it, partially because few families knew. They wouldn't necessarily inform parents that their child had died. Or when they did, it was months later. So, there are kind of three segments in the Canadian residential school history. 1820 to 1880, and then around 1880, the transportation systems in Canada and the communication systems are a little bit better. Then it's a little bit of a blur where some parents would request the remains transported back to their family tribal lands, some wouldn't, some were informed and some weren't. And then from about 1920 on, there was pretty good records of families being informed and decisions being made intentionally. Now, it wouldn't be much of a surprise to you that most of the unmarked graves that we find are from before 1920. Those would be the students who either parents weren't informed and we had to make a decision, or some tragedy occurred and the ground was about to freeze over for winter, so we needed to bury them quick and we couldn't do it where we normally would, and then we forgot where the graves were. Like, almost all of the graves that we find that we're surprised to find are before 1920.
What do you know about the reasons for death for many of these?
Yes. As you might suspect, before 1940, they're almost all tuberculosis. I'm going to make up a number. I don't know this perfectly accurate, but it would be something like 90% of deaths are tuberculosis related before about 1940. And it's this tragic cycle of a student gets tuberculosis, maybe they get sent home to their tribal community that infects their tribal community, and then more kids come back with tuberculosis and it just circulates throughout the school dormitories. So tuberculosis is the big one. After that, it would be other illnesses, dysentery, those kinds of things. Accidents are surprisingly high. There are a lot of drownings, a lot of disappearances. Either they run away or something happened to the student and we don't know what. I think the popular imagination would like to suggest that there was murders taking place. There's not that much evidence of kids being murdered. It did happen, or kids were abused to such a degree that there were suicides, and there's definitely those things in the stories and in the records, but not to the degree that I think people would drum up or dramatize to a high degree. Uncomfortably, I think we would really love there to be some mustachioed villain in the background that just wanted to see as many Indigenous kids die as possible. The evil that takes place in these kinds of situations is an evil of apathy and ignorance, an evil of really admirable intentions played out in a way that was harmful. And what scares me about that is that's a trap I can fall into so easily too. So I recognize that I need to check my values and inclinations and how I want to help with Indigenous communities, not make a conclusion about what I think would be best for that community and go do it, but to be in relationship with Indigenous peoples and let them set the trajectory for how to do it, because I could so easily be the villain.
Hi, Trent.
Hi.
This last comment that you made about is very, very important, I think. But have you seen Sugarcane, the documentary that's up for an Academy Award tonight? Dale has. But But that one suggests there was a lot of evil intent, at least with infants and so forth.
Yeah.
The maker of that documentary, I just want to say for the rest of us, has an article in the New York Times this week saying I was nominated for an Academy Award, and this is what I think should happen next. But I think we should see it.
Sugar cane. Okay.
I think it's available on Hulu and Disney, neither of which I have, but we can figure it out somehow. We should figure out a way to see it.
Yeah, I wonder if I trapped myself with saying small percentage. The number is big. I mean, small percentage of students are murdered, but it's a big number of students murdered. I mean, you're talking hundreds. So that puts into context how many died of tuberculosis. I mean, 20,000 died of tuberculosis and a couple of hundred were murdered. It's a small percentage of murdered students, but a shockingly disturbing number. Yeah.
I went to Bethel Library to find out if I could get some information on this school in Halstead.
Mm-hmm.
There was very, very little information there. So then I went to Halstead and asked around, and nobody knows anything.
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
can we find out more information about that?
I've been told that the library archives are a better place to start looking. So it's just attached to the library. Oh, okay.
Is John Thiessen here? The word that I have is that most of those records burned in the 20s when there was a fire at Herald Press Mennonite Weekly Review office or something. Anyway. I know the answer to this one because I've already asked it to Trent, but I'm still curious. Obviously, death and burial is a time when most cultures sort of reach into their cultural traditions. And it makes me wonder if any of these funerals had any hint of indigenous practice, or whether it was all straight Anglican. And then the broader question would be, at any point, was there acknowledgement of and showing any respect at all for the cultural traditions that these students came from?
On that continuum of history, the awareness of indigenous values and the willingness to honor indigenous values changes. So certainly before 1920, there's almost nothing. I can't think of a single document that would have included an indigenous term. One of the purposes of the institution was to move in a more Canadian direction or Anglican direction in some cases. The later you get, the closer to most deaths at the school are done by the 70s. There aren't that many deaths that take place at the residential schools between 71 and 91. But that is also right at the moment when an awareness in society starts to grow about indigenous values and indigenous perspectives and the desire to honor indigenous theologies. So no, the documents don't provide very much evidence that that was a priority.
Last one.
You made the comment that you didn't think most Indigenous schools had evil intentions or nefarious intentions. Well, what do you think about the common quote about kill the Indian, save the man? So that does not sound as though there was something all that enlightened about what their intentions were. They seemed rather going down a dark path.
Yes. I suppose I want to honor the humanity of everyone involved. And I look back in 2025 on their decisions and say, good grief, what were they doing? How could you do that to kids? I also understand that for a lot of participants in the system, the nuns who helped run the schools or the missionary teachers who were at the schools, they really did, a lot of them, not everybody, but a lot of them loved their students the way a 1920s teacher loved students. And a lot of them were racist. And a lot of them were shaped by values that I now look at and say are misguided, unenlightened. I hope what it communicates to me is to check my own heart and remind myself that somebody 100 years from now might look back on my choices and my values and think I'm just a moron, and they'll be right. That we are correct to call out the abuses and the evil, and to say the priorities are wrong, and to hold ourselves accountable to a higher standard, and look back and say we can't honor that, or we can't hide it under the rug, or we can't ignore it because it was wrong. But also to walk that tightrope to say, there were a lot of missionary women who held kids dying of tuberculosis and grieved it, just not in the same way. They didn't grieve every bit of the loss that I would grieve today. And that's the complexity of historical studies and working for justice along a growth curve. So hopefully that's something that we check ourselves on.
Well, on that note, let's express our appreciation to Trent.
Thank you.
And rejoice that he's on the faculty at Bethel College.
Thanks, Dale.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.